Hello there. Welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. For those of you that didn't see my last video, where I took a look at all of the SSX games running on the deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, we're going to test every single version of every single Burnout game on the Steam Deck. For those of you that are new to the series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across both console and PC, and record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I then give each game a compatibility score out of 10, and issue a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a game to get top marks, it needs to run at its full correct frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Additionally, each port needs to render at the deck's native resolution. I'll also be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus, yeah? It's worth mentioning that these videos take a lot of time to put together. With that in mind, I want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. If you have a particular franchise that you'd like to see tested on deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. Oh, and as always, I'll only be testing through SteamOS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games. Kicking things off with the original Burnout, and man, I know I say this every time, but it's really strange to come back to the original entries of these franchises. Launching in November of 2001 for the PlayStation 2 and April of the following year for Xbox and GameCube, Burnout is as purebred an arcade racer as you can get. It essentially plays like a stripped down version of the series' later entries. You duck, dodge and weave your way through urban courses utterly plagued with traffic and build up your boost meter as you go by drifting around corners and narrowly avoiding crashes. You can only use that boost so long as your boost meter is full, and if you crash, which I did a lot, a hefty chunk of that sweet elixir is nabbed directly from you. There are two things that strike me upon revisiting this game. One is that it feels remarkably Dreamcast in nature. It's got that sort of challenging, no-frills, arcadey appeal that Dreamcast games tended to have, and I'm into it. The second is that despite Burnout lacking the additional modes and features of its successors, there's a sort of purity in this particular game that I feel the later games are missing. There were multiple instances whilst I was playing Burnout where an opponent's vehicle would crash into some dumb civilian about 100 feet ahead of me. And it's at those moments where the game's handling and audio and graphical effects all came together to form these micro challenges that felt completely exhilarating. Trying to bob and weave your way through the oncoming wreckage is really hard, and scraping through by the skin of your teeth never fails to elicit a reaction. Testing the game out on deck then, and we're starting with the Xbox version of the game running within XEMU. I'm using the recommended settings that I've listed down in the description for this one, and the experience is passably good. For those of you that have watched the last few episodes, you'll know that's saying something, as XEMU's performance as an emulator is notoriously spotty, especially on the Steam Deck. The visuals here are a pretty close match for the console version, and there doesn't seem to be any egregious glitches getting in the way of the experience. Performance is fine. I did notice some slowdown that had a particular effect on controller response as I played, which could be considered a deal breaker in a game based entirely around reaction times. I did find, however, that they weren't bad enough that I couldn't adjust. Frame pacing can be spotty, but the game's output was mostly quite smooth when it mattered. Audio, which is a particular highlight here by the way, holds up well once you're in-game, but it does crackle a touch when we're in the menus, as if someone is frying some lovely sausages right next to your Steam Deck. In summary, Burnout within XEMU on Steam Deck is pretty good. The game's occasional frame rate gripes do hold this version back from receiving top marks, however its competently competent presentation and performance earned the game a respectable 7 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. Next up, we've got the PlayStation 2 version of the game running via PPSSPP. I booted up this port expecting a slam dunk in terms of performance and a 9 or a 10 out of 10 compatibility score, but no, sadly that isn't the case. You might be looking at this footage thinking, well, what's the problem? It runs at 60 frames per second, frame pacing looks smooth, and the audio is good. And yeah, you'd be right in saying all of that. What you can't see, however, is input latency. Thankfully, this isn't a factor I've had to mention up until now, but PPSSPP has had a long-standing issue with input latency, and you don't have to go very far on the internet to find someone complaining about it. Now, granted, overall latency within the emulator has definitely improved in recent years. However, the issue is still present enough for it to cause real problems with this game. It honestly felt as though there was a good half second between my inputs and the action taking place on screen. This made fulfilling my mandate of driving dangerously honestly impossible. To me, this is a deal breaker. I couldn't play the game properly. However, I am aware of how subjective a topic input latency is, so give it a try as it might be okay for you. Despite pixel perfect visuals, great audio and smooth performance, PPSSPP's poor input latency has robbed Burnout of its true glory on deck, landing the game with a 6 out of 10 compatibility score. Rounding out the roster of Burnout ports, we've got the GameCube version of the game running within Dolphin. Say it with me now folks, we've been through this enough times. Dolphin has shit frame pacing on the Steam Deck. Honestly, I'm edging closer to the day in which I'll just be able to copy and paste that audio for every GameCube game I test on deck, and it's heartbreaking. Every 15 seconds or so, Dolphin's performance tumbles, despite the frame rate graph reading a flat 60 frames per second. The game looks great on deck, the audio is nigh on perfect, and the controller response is good in between those bouts of stutter. It's the inconsistency of the experience that really drags the whole thing down. As I've mentioned before, it's difficult to establish how much Dolphin's developers can do to fix this, as this could be a SteamOS issue specifically. With that said, I've been on Dolphin's own forums a good bit recently, where other users have been testing Dolphin on deck, coming to the same conclusion as me, and sharing their findings. They haven't really been receiving any responses from Dolphin's team, however, which is very disheartening. In light of this being a fast-paced racing game, it's hard to cut Burnout on Dolphin much slack. The emulator's long-standing issues on deck immensely hamper the game's playability, and it scores a compatibility score of 5 out of 10. And there we have it, each version of Burnout tested on deck. It's a shame that none of these ports could really excel on Valve's handheld, as there's a lot to love in this inaugural entry. Here are each of the scores as a refresher, and lo and behold, the Xbox takes its first win of the series. Well done, Xbox. The console couldn't be here to accept its award today, but we have been asked to thank both Peter Moore's ARM and World Premiere on its behalf. Just 1 year after Criterion made their opening statement with Burnout, its sequel Point of Impact was unleashed. It's frankly ridiculous to imagine a sequel of this depth launching less than 12 months after its predecessor, but this was back when a 2-year development cycle was considered long. Burnout II chiefly aimed to address one of the most common critiques levelled at the first game. Fans and critics alike said, hey, we love this, but we just want more of it. Well, Criterion were happy to oblige. Burnout 2 offered up more courses, more vehicles, better visuals, refined mechanics, and the first appearance of the franchise's eponymous Crash mode. The only criticism I can conceivably level at Burnout 2 is that it's an easier game this time around. However, you could argue that for the sake of accessibility, this was an essential change to make. I have a lot of very happy memories associated with this game, specifically around bringing it out to my cousin's house every weekend for like a year. In a pass-the-pad environment like that, Burnout 2's thrills and spills cemented it as the ultimate 12-year-old boy's game. So how does the game fare on deck? The first version we're checking out is the PS2 version of the game, once again running within PPSSPP. Oddly enough, the high input latency that impacted the first game in the series so heavily feels like less of a factor here. Perhaps the game is simply responsive enough in and of itself to accommodate for the emulator's high lag. Either way, the controls here feel pretty good. You can still notice the latency if you go looking for it, but the game isn't ruined by it. Visually, the game looks strong, with all of the relevant visual effects transferring over from console to emulator successfully. Performance isn't perfect, with frame pacing in particular a little stuttery for my liking, but it's far from the kind of variance we typically see in Dolphin. With all of that said, the biggest drawback in this version of the game is its audio. Criterion utilised a pretty advanced method of synthesis in creating Burnout 2's engine sounds, and I think that might be what's causing these issues. Music tracks playing in the background sound fine, however your car sounds like it's full of wasps. The audio issues present in Burnout 2 within PPSSPP hold the game back from receiving a perfect score. However, the visual quality and decent level of performance bump up the playability for me. Burnout 2 on PPSSPP gets a compatibility score of 7 out of 10. For our next port, we're taking a look at the Xbox version of the game, which you can see is running extremely slowly. That was a joke about how slow the game is running. To be frank, I don't know what's going on here. I tried toggling every possible setting within both the deck itself and the emulator and any combination of the two, but the game seems intent on running at half speed. I mean, it makes the game very easy if that's what you're after, but I wouldn't recommend it myself. There isn't much point in spending any additional time on this one. Burnout 2 TikTok Slowed Edition gets a miserly 2 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. It's crap. Speaking of crap, is that too harsh? Regardless, here's the GameCube version of the game running in Dolphin, the first emulator ever to edge me closer to a nervous breakdown. Hyperbole aside, we're dealing with the same set of issues every other Dolphin game we've tested suffers from, namely poor frame pacing. Outside of that, the game looks really great within Dolphin. Its upscaling is perhaps the best of the bunch, and input latency is negligible when the game isn't stuttering all over itself. I sincerely hope that the upcoming release of SteamOS 3.5 and its supposed SMT related fixes goes some way toward remedying Dolphin's issues. For now, the game's frame time woes landed with a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10. We finish up our testing of Burnout 2 with a decidedly mixed bag in terms of results and no real clear winner. Instead, we have like a best loser. Recapping the scores, we can see that the PS2 version of the game takes the crown with a 7 out of 10 score. The console isn't here to collect its award, but it has asked us to thank both Jake from Dog's Life and London Cab Challenge on its behalf. So, how do you improve on excellence? Well, if the year happens to be 2004 and your publisher is EA Games, you put Burnout 3 Takedown out into the world and you watch the good times roll. Perhaps the biggest contribution that Burnout 3 made to the overall series was a sense of global appeal that was probably spurred on by having EA as a publisher. Gone were the slightly cheesy UI and vehicle designs of the prior games, and in was a cool factor that allowed Burnout 3 to sit comfortably next to EA's other key franchises at the time. I was absolutely pumped for this game in 2004. It was like top of the Christmas list, having been such a huge fan of Burnout 2. At the time, this game fulfilled every wish I had for a sequel, in that it felt like more of the same, but better looking. Coming back to it now, however, and I don't know, it doesn't feel like Burnout 3 has aged as well as other titles in the series. For all of its bombast and flair, it's easier to see the trickery that underpins the experience. Opponents rubber band a lot in order to keep things exciting, car handling is looser and more dramatic, and the game feeds you audio cues like they're going out of style, constantly reminding you that you're doing something cool. There's a lot to be said for the systems-driven mayhem of the earlier games, when the rules that govern the experience felt more embedded into the mechanics and less like dramatic set dressing. That could just be me though. As for getting the game running on steamdeck, well, we're kicking things off with the PS2 version of the game running via PPSSPP. Visually, this version of the game is a winner. It looks great. Longtime users of PPSSPP will know that this game used to suffer from a particularly nasty bug that saw the sky rendered as a black abyss. This literally took years to fix, so it's great to see that issue resolved both in general and on Steam Deck. The game's soundscape is incredibly strong and also transitions to the deck successfully. All of the necessary crunches, scrapes, thuds and wallops are accurately preserved here for your enjoyment. Despite all of these good things, the input latency in Burnout 3 is a bad thing, and it really hampers the experience. As I mentioned before, this is such a contentious and subjective topic that I would recommend you try the game out for yourself and make your own mind up. What's probably compounding the issue for me is Burnout 3's looser handling model, which, in conjunction with the lag, just feels pretty lousy. Taking all of that into consideration then, I have to give this game a rating. Despite the quality of the emulation here on a visual level, the strong performance and the smooth frame pacing, the input latency present severely impacts my moment-to-moment enjoyment of Burnout 3. The PS2 version of the game gets a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on deck. Boy oh boy, am I excited to play the Xbox version of Burnout 3 via XEMU. Hang on, why isn't it doing that? That's right folks, in the second XEMU flop of the episode we have Burnout 3 stalling on its initial load. I took a peek at XEMU's compatibility database and it seems I'm not alone in experiencing this problem. According to user tests, this game only works as intended on Nvidia GPUs, at least for the time being. Given that the game doesn't function on deck, it's safe to say we won't be awarding top marks to Burnout 3 on XEMU. Seeing as it does boot up, however, I'm happy to concede that it gets a 1 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Some rather disappointing results then for Burnout III Takedown on Steam Deck. Here's the scores as a recap, and it's safe to say that despite its latency related problems, the PlayStation 2 version of the game wins this bout. It's also tentatively being awarded this episode's Shittest Victory Award. Congratulations, PlayStation. If you had told me in 2004 that just 1 year after Burnout 3's release, I'd be sitting behind the wheel of that game's vehicles and driving that game's circuits on a handheld, well, I'd have told you to step away from me and refrain from contacting me or my family. Nevertheless, that turned out to be true, with Burnout Legends releasing in 2005 for both the PSP and the DS. Serving as a kind of greatest hits compilation, the game brought together the series' best courses, cars and modes from the first 3 games, and shocked us all in the process. Design-wise, the game really excels, at least on PSP. The handling model feels like it retains more of Burnout II's identity than the third entries, which I personally prefer. The orchestration that dominated the third game seems toned down as well, with opponents rubber banding less than they did in Takedown. The game runs at 30 FPS as opposed to 60, and yeah, sure, the visuals aren't as tasty as the original games, but this was like nothing we'd ever seen before. In just one generation, never mind that, in 1 year, what was considered cutting edge in the home was now in the palm of your hand. You really can't expect better than that. Imagine a year after Uncharted 4 was released, Sony put out a handheld that could play that game natively. It was essentially that. Taking a look at Legends on Steam Deck, we're starting with the PSP version of the game. I feel like I can finally share some good news regarding this franchise on deck, as the PSP port of Legends transitions extremely well to Valve's handheld. Performance is mostly pegged at that 30 FPS limit. This game exhibits frame drops on real PSP hardware, so I'm not too surprised to see those drops occasionally appearing on deck. In terms of visuals, the game is close to being perfect, but it doesn't quite hit the mark. As you play, you'll notice some rendering mishaps occurring toward the edge of your vision. It doesn't impact gameplay at all, but it is there and it is noticeable. The audio is mostly perfect too. However, crashing your vehicle sounds like it's being bass boosted, which isn't very nice. In summary, the PSP port of Legends is great on deck. The performance is a close match for original hardware, and it upscales nicely to the deck's screen. Audio is good aside from the crunchy crashes, and visually it's very close to the PSP. This version of the game gets a 9 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. Right, so this is rubbish anyway. You look at the PSP version of Legends and you see a game that has a modicum of heart and soul in it, a bit of intent behind its creation. Cast your eyes over the DS version of the game and it feels like you're looking at the end result of an argument. There was clearly some stipulation somewhere at EA that this game would launch across both PSP and DS, regardless of the gulf in quality between the two ports. The nicest thing I can say about the DS version of the game is that it thankfully didn't compromise the PSP version during its development. EA were happy to let Criterion soldier on and make the PSP version as good as they could, whilst Visual Impact were working away in the mines to chisel out the DS port. Hang on, Visual Impact? I remember that name. Oh no! If you have any nostalgia associated with this port, then you'll be happy to know that it transitions over to Steam Deck without any real issues. The DS port of Burnout Legends gets a 9 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. And that's both versions of Burnout Legends tested on deck. And it looks like we have a tiebreaker. Both games have scored 9 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. So what we're going to do is give the award to the game that isn't shit. It's the PSP version. The PSP couldn't be here to accept its award today, however we have been asked to thank both the noise UMDs make and Analog Nubs on its behalf. Brilliant. By the time it became apparent to Criterion that they would need to develop a fourth mainline Burnout game, I can't imagine it was an easy pill to swallow. How would they iterate on a franchise that had kind of designed itself into a corner, and at the tail end of a console generation no less? Well, somehow they managed to put out a sequel that pleased everybody. And I mean everybody. Looking back at the review scores for Burnout Revenge, I'm shocked at how unanimously positive they are. It's not that I don't think Revenge is a good game, it just isn't very different from Takedown. To its credit, the game is polished to a mirror's sheen, and the refinements that have been made to the game's handling, boosting and drifting mechanics make for an effortlessly enjoyable experience. In fact, having skipped Revenge back in the day, I'm eager to jump in now and see what all the fuss was about. And what better way to do that than on my Steam Deck? Oh, okay. So this is the Xbox version of the game running within XEMU, and right from the get-go we're having a really hard time getting through these menus based on how poor the performance is. With that said, once we're actually in a race event, performance evens out enough to deliver an okay experience. It ain't perfect, it's running at about half its intended frame rate, but it's playable. Visually, the game looks really nice, and the presentation within XEMU is top notch. Rather surprisingly, audio holds up too, despite the low frame rate. I would imagine this is because the game is skipping frames correctly in order to maintain the correct speed. This is also what's allowing the game to feel as responsive as it does. As nice as I'm being to the Xbox version of Burnout Revenge on deck, I still need to rate it. Whilst the game looks and sounds lovely, the performance woes that keep the frame rate from its 60 FPS target result in this port of Revenge scoring a 6 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Hopping over to PPSSPP to check out the PS2 version of the game, and the first hurdle we've managed to clear is performance. Thankfully, Revenge's PS2 version runs at a near locked 60 frames per second on deck, which feels like an enormous leap coming from XEMU. Turning our attention toward the visuals, they are essentially a perfect match for the game on console. It is disappointing to see a slight step down in quality from the Xbox version, however. It would have been really nice to pair the PS2 version's performance with the Xbox port's looks. PPSSPP's infernal faux input latency does rear its ugly head again. However, it isn't the deal breaker that it was in Burnout 3. It doesn't feel like it hindered my experience with the game in any major way this time around, which was a nice change of pace. In light of this positive showing, I'm happy to say that Burnout Revenge gets a not too shabby 8 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. Just a few short months after Burnout Revenge launched on PS2 and Xbox, Criterion put out a port for Microsoft's shiny new 360 box console. Here it is running on the Steam Deck via XENIA. Looks good, doesn't it? Well, don't be fooled, because this is just the menu. This is what it looks like once you're in-game. You get audio, but no image on screen. Despite how nice Burnout Revenge might sound on the Xbox 360, I think we were aiming for more of a game than an audiobook. The 360 port gets a 1 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. And there we have it, all 3 versions of Burnout Revenge put through their respective paces. Here's a rundown of the scores, and the PlayStation 2 version takes the proverbial crown. I can't think of any more funny things to thank on behalf of the PS2, so we're just going to move on to the next section, I think. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with the subtitle of our next game. Nevertheless, Burnout Dominator was released in March of 2007 for both the PlayStation 2 and the PSP. At this point in the series, it feels like we've reached the first truly non-essential Burnout. Again, much like Revenge, I don't think this game is an especially bad one, it's just decidedly average in its makeup. For starters, the visuals are a noticeable step down from Revenge. The home console version of Dominator was almost certainly ported upward from the PSP, as opposed to Burnout Legends, which repurposed existing PS2 assets for the handheld. The developers at least attempted to reinvigorate the series by designing Dominator around the risk-reward play of the franchise's earlier entries. In this game, we're back to relying on driving dangerously and filling your boost bar entirely before letting it rip. They fumbled it, however, as you can still boost in Burnout Dominator without filling your bar all the way to the top. You just can't earn while you burn, as the game puts it. This means that if you don't fill your boost bar completely before using it, you won't be able to earn more whilst you boost. The biggest criticism I can level at Dominator is that it doesn't include Crash mode. What were they thinking? This might have something to do with the fact that Dominator is the only game in the series that wasn't developed by Criterion. Instead, it was EA UK helming the project. This, along with the game's odd choice of target platforms, leads me to believe that Burnout Dominator was put together quickly and cheaply. So, how does the experience transition over to the deck then? Well, here's the PS2 version of the game running within PPSSPP. Visually, the game holds up well, and I didn't notice any significant glitches or issues that drew me away from the action. Performance was a bit of a mixed bag though. I was able to work my way past some notable performance dips by re-enabling SMT within Power Tools. That's right, SMT was actually switched on for this particular game. I also reset the GPU clock speeds back to their automatic default, which smoothed performance further. I'm not sure what's so special about Dominator that it seems to fly in the face of every other PS2 game we've tested for the series, but here we are. Where this game does line up with past experiences is unfortunately in its input latency. All I'll say is that it's noticeable. Taking everything into consideration then, the PS2 port of Dominator transitions well to the Steam Deck. I can't mark the game down too heavily based on its input latency, as it is a subjective point of contention. With that said, Dominator gets an 8 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. Booting up the PSP version of Dominator, and the first thing I'm hit by is how well it holds up for a PSP game. The texture work in particular deserves a mention, as there's a surprising amount of detail in the environment. It's definitely a leap in fidelity over Burnout Legends. Performance lands us back in 30 frames per second territory as opposed to the PS2's 60, but despite the drop, it doesn't feel like a huge loss. Perhaps more importantly, that performance is maintained within PPSSPP on the deck, with only mild stutters occasionally making their presence felt. Aside from that, there isn't a whole lot to complain about here. The game upscales nicely to the deck's screen, performance is good, and controller response is arguably superior to the PCSX2 despite the lower frame rate. Burnout Dominator's PSP port, try saying that 10 times fast, gets a 9 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. With Burnout Dominator tested and rated, we're sadly saying goodbye to the 6th generation of consoles for this episode. With that said, here are the scores for this round, and shockingly, the PSP edges out the competition. The PSP couldn't be here to accept its award today, however it did ask us to thank both bulging batteries and the Talkman bird on its behalf. As a gamer, it's common to be confronted with games that sound absolutely brilliant on paper, but falter when you actually go hands-on with them. For me, Burnout Paradise was one of those games. Upon hearing that we'd get to play an open-world Burnout game, that any road could be a racetrack, every junction a crash opportunity, I was inner than in, I was all in. It wasn't until I got a hold of the game in the weeks following its release that I realised just how much the series had lost in order to get to where it now stood. If I can say one positive, albeit backhanded thing about Burnout Paradise, it's that it made me realise just how much the earlier games in the series had excelled at meticulously crafting endlessly replayable courses and events. With Burnout now open world, the crafted nature of the franchise's excellent circuits is gone, and we're instead left with a series of rather forgettable roads haphazardly cobbled together into courses. The absence of a purposefully designed crash mode is also a huge mark against Paradise. Allowing you to crash anywhere flies in the face of the choreographed ballet that crash mode once was. This time around, you just have to bank on the AI systems governing the world, spawning traffic when you need it. The biggest sin this game commits, however, at least in my eyes, is its mishandling of Burnout's moment-to-moment formula. Instead of having to focus on obstacles and opponents whilst whipping around memorable courses, now navigating the circuit itself is the biggest hurdle to overcome. The absence of a constant guide arrow or any overt signposts in the world mean that your attention is constantly being pulled away from what's in front of you as you try and scour the UI to figure out when to make turns. Whilst Burnout Paradise reviewed remarkably well at the time of its release, this is a hill that I'm happy to die on. Linear Burnout is better Burnout. With that rant out of the way, let's get to testing. The first version of Paradise we're taking a look at is the PS3 version, the same version I originally played back when the game was released in 2008. Our first barrier to entry with this particular port is having to wait an inordinate amount of time for those dang PPU modules to compile. Once we're past that, we get a rendition of Guns N' Roses' Paradise City that sounds as though it's being streamed from the surface of Jupiter. The audio here is absolutely dreadful, and is paired with terrible performance through emudeck's default settings for RPCS3. Burnout Paradise rather valiantly continued the franchise's trend of running at a flat-out 60 frames per second. On deck, however, the PS3 version is running closer to a cinematic 20 FPS. In light of Paradise's paltry performance and shit audio via RPCS3 on Steam Deck, the game scores a compatibility rating of 4 out of 10. Blech. Switching our attention to the PS3's 7th gen rival, we have the Xbox 360 version of Paradise running within XENIA. As I've mentioned before, there isn't a native Linux version of XENIA available on deck as of yet. However, you can mangle the emulator onto your deck with incredibly mixed results. Speaking of mixed results, look at this! You'd be forgiven for thinking that this is some weird Tron adjacent spin-off of the series exclusively available for the 360. But no, this is just how the actual game fares within XENIA on deck. Even getting in-game in this version was difficult, as UI text didn't seem to render at all. Not that it was worth the struggle anyway, eh? Thanks to its trippy aesthetic, wobbly performance, and exclusive Guess the Menu game, Paradise on XENIA scores a wonderful 2 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. For the sake of being thorough, it's worth mentioning that Burnout Paradise is also available in remastered form on both the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Thanks to neither of those versions being emulatable on the deck, however, it means we can't test them for this episode. For that heinous crime, both versions score a 0 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Next. It's at this point in the episode that we get to allow Proton, the deck's Linux-based compatibility layer, to flex its muscles with the PC version of Paradise. To be clear, there are actually two separate versions of Paradise available for the PC. The version you're currently looking at is Burnout Paradise: The Ultimate Box. This is the original version of the game released back in 2009, which featured some additional DLCs over the base game. I'm happy to report that this particular iteration of Paradise runs extremely well on the deck. There's essentially no tweaking required in order to get this port running on Valve's handheld. The visuals are a match for the original release version of the game. You don't get the extra visual loveliness packaged in with the remastered version, of course, but what's here still looks good. The only criticism I can level at this version is that the frame pacing can be a little erratic. I tried toggling allow tearing within the deck's overlay to see if that remedied the situation, but it unfortunately did nothing. There's likely some weird VSync shenanigans going on within the game itself that aren't tweakable via the game's settings. Despite that though, Burnout Paradise: The Ultimate Box's PC version has an incredibly strong showing on deck. Great performance, crisp visuals, crackle-free audio, and only mild frame pacing stutter result in this port getting a 9 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. As for the PC port of Burnout Paradise Remastered, well, that doesn't do too well here. In fact, by default, the game doesn't work at all, thanks in most part to EA's overbearing launcher causing massive issues with compatibility. I did manage to locate a guide on getting the game running on deck with extensive amounts of tweaking, which I'll include in the description. However, I can't help but feel it's a curiosity more than anything, given that the original version runs so well. Burnout Paradise Remastered's PC port gets a compatibility rating of 2 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Now, there is another way to play the remastered version of Burnout Paradise on Steam Deck, and it involves emulating a certain console that can be played both as a handheld and a home console. You know what I mean? You know the machine I'm referring to here? Its name rhymes with Flipendo Twitch. Anyway, there are two emulators we can test here, one beginning with R and the other beginning with Y. I'm really sorry to have to be so vague here, but I put a lot of work into these videos and I'd hate to see them get sniped from afar, if you get my drift. Running the game within the Y emulator, and it's essentially a write-off. Textures flicker like crazy and the game is unplayable as a result. Switching over to the R emulator, however, and I have to say I'm extremely impressed with how well this port runs on deck. Visually, the game looks great and is arguably the best looking version of the game we can easily get running on our Steam Decks. The variable level of performance definitely keeps me from outright recommending this version of the game as being playable. However, I'm inclined to say give it time. This emulator in particular has been jumping from strength to strength to strength in recent months, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw huge improvements in the near future. Strong visuals and great audio bump this port up in the rankings, but massively wobbly performance keeps it from earning the big bucks. Burnout Paradise on the Mystery console earns a compatibility rating of 5 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Goodness gracious, that was quite the round, wasn't it? We touched upon a whopping 7 versions of Burnout Paradise, of which only 4 could be booted up on a Steam Deck. Here are the scores as a reminder, if I can fit them all in on screen, and the PC version takes the victory with a score of 9 out of 10. The personal computer couldn't be here to accept its award today, but it did ask us to thank both IP addresses and Coilwine on its behalf. Good stuff. What better way to follow up on Burnout's biggest entry than to end with its smallest and arguably worst one? Whilst researching this video, I was shocked to find that it was Criterion themselves that developed 2011's Burnout Crash. I had just assumed that EA would have pawned this off on some unsuspecting developer, someone eager to make tracks in what was, at the time, a rapidly shifting industry. Burnout Crash is the byproduct of changing tides. Despite Paradise's acceptable level of success, a true follow-up failed to materialise in the years following its release. For some reason, Burnout was instead seen by EA as a suitable fit for the passive mobile game market, which Burnout Crash was primarily aimed at. The game repurposes Burnout's signature mode into an arcadey top-down affair that's as pick up and play as it is largely forgettable. The sneering, edgy swagger of the series was cast off in an attempt to broaden its appeal. So instead, there's this twee kind of comedy aesthetic to the game's presentation that has frankly aged like milk. Burnout didn't deserve to have Crash as its closing chapter. Even if Criterion themselves are largely made up of a different set of individuals these days, I'm sure there are plenty of independent developers out there who would kill to have the opportunity to chaperone the series in a faithful yet modern manner. Anyway, enough sentiment. How does the game run on deck? To cut to the chase, it doesn't. There are 3 versions of Burnout Crash released across the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360 and iOS. It goes without saying that the iOS version is a wash. That gets a 0 out of 10. The mangled version of XENIA on deck makes it impossible to launch Xbox Live Arcade games correctly, so that gets a 0 too. And the PlayStation 3 launches to a lovely black screen. Great. Oh, also a 0 out of 10. So we close out this episode with a tiebreaker. For this, I employ the who cares clause, as it's Burnout Crash. Sorry, Burnout Crash. And there we have it. Every single port of every single Burnout game assessed on Steam Deck. We've had some laughs, we've had some emulator-induced migraines, but most importantly, we've ticked another franchise off of a very long list. Thank you very much for joining me on this adventure, and make sure to tune in next time where I'll be testing a series that rhymes with vape intake. See ya!